Hello and welcome back to the Cybersecurity Crash Course for small and mid-sized businesses. Today, we're talking about using SPF, DKIM, and DMARC for email authentication. Email authentication makes it more difficult for scammers and attackers to send phishing or scamming emails that look like they originate or come from your company. They allow the recipient to verify that an email is actually from your company and to block emails from imposters, or they maybe will send them to quarantine folder and notify you about people trying to spoof your domain. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at SPF, DKIM, and DMARC as authentication for email. This is the lesson number 10 in the Cybersecurity Crash Course. If you have not watched the previous lessons, be sure that you go back. There are important topics, demos, exercises we've done in those that will help you understand this lesson better and help you secure your business. And before we get into the lesson, be sure that you check out the companion guide at the link shown. Any links we talk about, any tools we talk about will be in there. There will be some vocabulary, some definitions, some checklists and guides to help you building your cybersecurity program that will be invaluable to you. And they are completely free at the link provided. Before we can actually start talking about SPF, DKIM, and DMARC, and email authentication, you have to understand email technology and the way email works. So email is not a point-to-point communication. When you send an email, it doesn't go from your computer to the recipient's computer. There's quite a big process that happens in between. At step number 1, you're sitting on your computer and you want to send an email. And you want to send an email to person@company1.com. So when you hit send, your email actually goes to a mail server from your provider. So if you're using Gmail, your email goes to your Gmail mail server. That mail server says, okay, you want to send this email to person@company1.com. Where is company1.com? They send a query out to a DNS server. DNS servers tell them company1.com is at this IP address. And it gives them DNS records, an IP address record, MX records for mail, SPF, DKIM, DMARC, and a host of other record options that can be provided, not just for email, but for many other reasons as well. So when your server gets that message back, it says, okay, so company1.com is at X IP address. That's where they want their mail to go. Your company server or the server mail provider then sends your message to that server who passes it on to the inbox of the recipient. And at that DNS lookup point, we can add some instructions for security that help cut down on spam and phishing a lot. They are not the end-all solution. They're not a silver bullet. There are ways around them, and there are ways that experienced phishing or social engineers can get around them, but it will cut out a lot of spam and a lot of phishing at your organization. So let's take a look at SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. Email was invented in 1972. And the way that hackers or attackers can spoof email is really in the email headers. Email is kind of like a package you get. When UPS brings you a package, there's usually the box with an address on the outside. And sometimes, a lot of times, there is a letter or some kind of document, sales document, address document on the inside with another set of addresses. And what an attacker does is, because email is set up the same way, they try to spoof the mail from address. And so the process when an email is sent is there's a whole communication process that we have right here, and that mail from is relayed inside of that. As you can see, that mail from james.baker@company1.com, that can be spoofed, and the recipient, the replies, come back to mary.jane@company2.com. And what we see is attackers can make use of this to look like they are sending mail from one email address when they're actually not. And again, we see the whole envelope structure, and this is what attackers use to spoof email addresses. So the first security control that you can use to begin validating emails is Sender Policy Framework, or SPF. And what happens with SPF is your domain administrator publishes a DNS record, an SPF DNS record, That is essentially a policy that defines what mail servers are authorized to send email on behalf of your domain. So if your company is company1.com, gmail.com should not be sending emails as your domain, right? And that's what an SPF record does. It tells the recipient who is allowed to send email on that company's behalf. And this bold V equals SPF1 in the IP address is a very, very simple SPF record, and that's what they look like. So what happens is on inbound messages, the receiving server will do a lookup for rules on the SPF record. If it fails, they will look up the rules to see what they should do. And that receiving server will then compare the allowed senders from the SPF record with the information they have in that email envelope to see when they receive that email, is that an allowed sender? What should they do with it? And that tells them, should they accept the email, should they reject it, or should they flag the message and send it on to their recipient? So the way SPF records are structured is pretty simple. It's a TXT record with this phrase in it, V equals SPF1. Then you can break down. You can do this on an IP address. You can do this on a domain, as you see in the very bottom one, spf.protection.outlook.com. If you're using something like Outlook, you can do a mixture of both. And that really is going to depend on how you have this set up and how strict you want to be enforcing SPF. There are 2 all tags that tell what to do with a fail to the recipient. That tells the recipient how to handle failed SPF records, a soft fail or a hard fail. And a soft fail means that the recipient can decide how they want to handle. Today, this is usually only used for debugging because now we have DMARC, which provides more information how it should be handled. And the -all is a hard fail, and that means to completely reject the message. And this should only be used when you are confident that your SPF records are worked. You might want to set up a soft fail, do some tests, be sure everything's working all right, and then move to a hard fail. Okay, the next email authentication we have is DKIM. And DKIM uses public key cryptography to verify that an email is sent from an authorized server and it's not been intercepted or altered in the meantime. So DKIM lets the receiver check that the email was both sent and authorized by the owner of that domain and that it's not been altered. And this is done using a digital signature header that's added to the email and secured via encryption. So let's talk about public key cryptography very, very quickly. Traditional cryptography or symmetric cryptography, we have one encryption and decryption key. I encrypt a message with key A, the recipient decrypts the message with key A. As you can imagine, this gets very, very hard when we don't have physical access to the person. How do I give them the key? I have a message I need to send to someone in China, in another country, and they need to decrypt it. I can't physically take them the key. How do I share it securely? And we have this example. Alice needs to send Bob a message. These are who you always hear about when we talk about public key cryptography. And public key cryptography uses 2 keys, one for encryption and one for decryption, and they're very, very large prime numbers. So Bob wants to send a message. He encrypts it with Alice's, the recipient's, public key. This is a key that they make known. The encrypted message is sent. The recipient uses their private key that no one knows to decrypt the message. When you want to send an encrypted message to an individual, you encrypt it with their public key so that only they can decrypt it with their private key. And that's essentially how public key cryptography works. So let's see how DKIM uses this. A domain administrator will generate some kind of public key pair that is a key that's used for a specific selector, and they publish that record and they set up a private key on their server. So the way this would look in this record would be just like the bold you see, where the V equals DKIM and the P would be the public key of that organization or that department if they are getting that granular. Next, when someone sends an email, they attach a DKIM signature header to every email that's sent. The way this works is non-essential items are removed. This is things like white space at the end of the letter. Non-essential elements are removed. A hash is created of the email body and the email header. Then a crypto signature is created and it's added to that DKIM signature. When all of this is done, the email is sent. And this would be what a typical DKIM signature added to an email would look like. So when the recipient receives that email, here's what they do. It's kind of the reverse process of what the sender did. They do a lookup of the public key of the organization. They use that key to decrypt the signature, to gain the private key to decrypt the signature, and they compute a hash of the email body and the email header, and they see if it matches that encrypted or now decrypted hash that they have received in the email. If it does, if it matches, we know that it was not altered in transit. The final email authentication protocol is DMARC, or Domain-Based Message Authentication Reporting and Conformance. And really, DMARC's job is to tell the recipient how should they handle an email if it fails DKIM or if it fails SPF. So what happens is when an email is received, the recipient checks, has DMARC been implemented? Has the organization set up DMARC for that domain? If the organization has set up DMARC, they then check, okay, does that email pass the DMARC authentication in SPF and DKIM? If so, the mailbox provider runs their own filters, checks the email, sends it to the recipient. If not, if the email does not pass DMARC, then some unique things can happen. Inside of the gray box, we see that the next step is the domain applies their own policy. Next, we see that the recipient can apply the domain policy of the owner. They can quarantine the message, they could reject it, they could take no action and send it to the recipient, or they could reject the message and send a report to the sender. This is kind of a flow chart of how that whole process works. And there's some interesting parts in a DMARC record. First of all, you have the protocol version, and that is a required component. Next, you have the protocol for the domain, and this is also required, and this tells what your domain wants recipient domains, recipient email servers to do when they receive emails that do not pass SPF or DKIM or DMARC. And in this case, the example is quarantine. There are other options you could use. Next is the PCT equals blank, and that is what % of the message is subject to filtering. This is an optional. You could set this to be 25%, 30%, whatever you choose. Then we have the reporting address, because the whole point in DMARC is for an organization to be able to keep track of individuals or attackers trying to spoof their email. So the recipient server would send a notification, hey, we got this fake message, blank message, this was the problem, here's a report. Another option you have under DMARC is DMARC domain alignment, and this expands domain validations so that the recipient server can be a little more strict in how they view SPF and DKIM. So a DMARC domain alignment matches a from domain with the information relevant to those protocols that we talked about. So in SPF, the from domain and the return path must match. Essentially, we're saying how strict are we going to be about SPF and DKIM? And with DKIM, the from domain and the DKIM D equals domain must match. Again, we're looking for consistency in all parts of the email, ruling out as many opportunities for a hacker or an attacker to spoof your email. And like we talked about briefly in our flowchart, there are a few options in DMARC for the sending organization to request to be done. You could put no action, which would treat the mail as if there were no DMARC validation, and it will be up to the recipient server. You can quarantine, ask that they quarantine to accept it, but send it to the junk or the spam, or you can ask that they reject the message outright. That is up to you how strict you want to be with DKIM. So those are the 3 email authentication protocols, SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. Be sure that you check out our companion guide that goes with this. We talk about a lot of the flags that you can use and how to set up this inside of your organization.